Kıymetli basın mensupları, hoş geldiniz, sefalar getirdiniz. Simultane tercümemiz mevcuttur. Basın toplantımızı İngilizce olarak yapacağız. Öncelikle bu sabah burada olduğunuz için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ben Taha Ayhan, İslam İşbirliği Gençlik Forumu Başkanıyım. İslam İşbirliği Gençlik Forumu olarak ve şahsen Gazze Mahkemesi, Gazze Tribunal'ın kurulmasıyla alakalı baştan itibaren destek olduk. Ve bugün burada Sayın Doktor Richard Falk ve Sayın Doktor Hilal Elver Hoca'nın dünyaya yeni bir önerisini sunmak için bulunuyoruz. Önce Gazze Mahkemesi nedir ondan kısaca bahsedip sonra konuyu özetleyip açılışı yapacağız inşallah. Ve sizin çok değerli sorularınızla ve mülakatlarınızla da konunun etkili olacağına inanıyoruz. Gazze Mahkemesi'ni bundan yaklaşık 12 ay önce tesis ettik. Bu konuya ömrünü vermiş olan daha evvelki Filistin özel raportörü, BM Filistin özel raportörü olan Sayın Doktor Richard Falk başkanlığında organize ettiğimiz bu mahkemede dünyanın önünde gelen entelektüellerini, aydınlarını, fikir insanlarını, aktivistlerini ve tanınmış insanları bir araya getirerek Gazze'de devam ede gelen soykırımın durdurulması ve bu soykırımda suçlu olanların tespit edilerek adalet önüne çıkarılması amacıyla bu mahkemeyi tesis ettik. Bu mahkemenin tesis edilmesindeki temel dürtü şuydu: 8 Ekim 2023 tarihinde başlayan İsrail soykırımının cezasız kaldığını, yaptırımsız kaldığını gördük ve buna karşı dünyanın her tarafında insanların adalet çağrıları olduğunu gördük ve bu adalet çağrılarının cevapsız kaldığını gördük. Buna karşı da istedik ki bu adalet çağrılarına dünyadaki entelektüeller, aydınlar ve fikir öncüsü insanlar cevap versinler. Tabii devam etmekte olan ceza mahkemesi ve adalet divanı süreçleri var. Bu mahkemenin temel dürtüsü buradaki bulunacak olan, elde edilecek olan çıktıların ceza mahkemesine, adalet divanına ve yerel mahkemelerde bir fayda sağlamasıdır. Ortak bir söylem üretilmesidir. Bu amaçla da mahkeme 3 ayrı daireden teşekkür etti. Birinci daire hukuk dairesi, ikinci daire felsefe ve insani bilimler dairesi ve üçüncü dairede uluslararası ilişkiler ve siyasi bilimler, siyans politik dairesi. Bu çok boyutlu bir şekilde Gazze'deki soykırımın ele alınması ve adalet çağrısının bir formüle oturtulması için bu mahkemeyi tesis etmiştik. Tabii son dönemde ortaya çıkan yeni gelişmeler ışığında işgalci İsrail Devleti'nin Başbakanı Netanyahu'nun açıkladığı yeni işgal planı karşısında bugün Doktor Falk ilk defa tüm ulusları, başta da Güvenlik Konseyi üyesi olan ülkeleri sert güç kullanımı dahil olmak üzere gereken tüm adımların atılması konusunda hukuki bir zemin olan koruma için harekete geç, responsible to protect hukuki kurumu dahilinde harekete geçmeye davet ediyor. Bununla alakalı Mahkeme Başkanı Sayın Richard Falk burada, İcra Komitesi üyesi Sayın Hilal Elver Hoca burada ki Hilal Elver Hoca da BM Gıda Raportörü ve mahkemenin yönetici sekreteri, executive director'ı Sayın Ahmet Köroğlu beyefendi buradalar. Ben sözü fazla uzatmadan bu noktada Sayın Richard Falk'a açıklamalarını yapmak ve daha sonra sizden alacağımız soruları cevaplamak üzere vermiş oluyorum. Tekrar katılımınız için teşekkür ediyorum. Sesimizi ve Gazze'nin sesini duyduğunuz için ayrıca teşekkür ediyorum ve sizin çabalarınıza muhtaç olduğumuzu bir kez daha ifade etmek istiyorum. Buyurun efendim.
Oh, no. Thank you very much for coming here and listening to our urgent message at this time of humanitarian emergency. As never before, those of us who formed the Gaza Tribunal by the fashion will be too late. Too late to save the people, to save the surviving people who have already been traumatized by more than 22 months of genocide. The world has been disoriented. The eyes and the ears of the world have been exposed as never before, including the Holocaust, to the transparency of genocide carried out in real time. It challenges our humanity to act at this point. And it is of great sadness that there has been such a complicit behavior on the part of the liberal democracies of the West. And we notice that there are changes underway. Gradually, the people of the West are reacting. Again, they have to react with a sense of urgency or it will be too late. And we're at that in historical time when the challenge is at its climax. And we hope we can at least alert the world to this situation of ultimate emergency for innocent people and for the whole dignity of humanity. The Gaza crisis has not been described as the moral crisis of our time idly. It has engaged people everywhere, and it's only now beginning to engage some governments, particularly of the global South. We are trying to address the conscience of all people and encourage the kind of activism that will produce changes in government behavior, particularly an arms embargo and various forms of sanctions, both public and civil society initiated, including the kind of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for basic rights, including the right of self-determination, that proved to be so unexpectedly effective in the context of the anti-apartheid campaign some 30 years earlier. It is against this background that the Gaza Tribunal has issued an emergency statement that is aimed at being responsive to this unique historical moral challenge in quest of justice. Law has failed because it hasn't been enforced. We speak on behalf of people and civil society. We will meet at the end of October here in Istanbul and feature a jury of conscience that will make a final set of verdicts and strong judgments. And it's our hope that this kind of civil society uprising reflects both a growing mood of dissatisfaction with what governments and international institutions are doing. And one further point is the sensitivity to this changing environment that has been expressed by the sanctioning of the UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestine, who was one of the leading tellers of truth, the messenger of truth to the world. A sanctioning by the US government that punished the truth teller and rewards those who have been disseminating lies about the realities of Gaza. This is reinforced by the August 10th assassination of Assas al-Shafir and his Al Jazeera colleagues in another violent, deliberate effort to silence truth tellers and to confound or confuse the world with falsehoods. So part of the Gaza Tribunal is to strengthen the role of truthful conceptions of reality. And that is of strategic importance to the well-being of the world, not only for Gaza, but for climate change and other issues before the world. Let me just introduce this emergency statement, which is our response to this historical moment. And I will, I think the statement's available to everyone here, but I will just read a couple of the paragraphs introducing it. Basically, the statement calls for the empowerment of the General Assembly of the UN to evade the veto in the Security Council and the slowness with which International Court of Justice operates, and its technical limitations to law, where, as I've tried to suggest, the real preoccupation at this point is with justice, which is a broader conception of doing the right thing. As was already suggested, and I'm now quoting from the statement, on August 7th, the National Security Cabinet of the Netanyahu government approved a decision opposed by Israel's own military high command to engage in a further Israel most lethal phase of genocide, involving the conquest of those portions of Gaza City where close to 1 million starving Palestinians are sheltered in fear and foreboding. Additionally, Israel's Prime Minister went beyond the decision by announcing extensions of the escalation to include central Gaza. The imminent escalation deeply challenges member governments of the UN, as well as the United Nations as an organization, and other multilateral institutions to take drastic action now. The drastic action that we propose involves a combination of relying on existing policy instruments within the reach of the UN at the present time, and it relies specifically on the notion of the Uniting for Peace resolution, which was enacted back in 1950, the time of the Korean War, and successfully invoked during the Suez crisis of 1956 to keep the UN responsible and effective despite the veto in the veto feared to be cast by the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. Subsequent to the Cold War, in the context of the genocide that affected Bosnia, the UN adopted the so-called responsibility to protect, or R2P, which was adopted by the UN 2005 summit, and specifically was designed to meet the kind of humanitarian and political crises of the sort that have been allowed to unfold over this period in Gaza. We are hopeful of participating in the upcoming General Assembly meetings in New York in September to bring this into the agenda of the UN in this spirit of emergency. We hope to have laid the groundwork for doing that by the action of releasing this statement today. Let me stop there and welcome your questions or responses.
Mikrofon alabilir miyiz acaba?
These are the steps, you know that first.
Maybe we can detail after the question. Maybe
Yeah.
we can detail.
Okay, questions?
Hi. You're here to raise your voice against Israel and make the world to take an action about what...
Introduce yourself.
My name is Gülistan. I am from 24 channel, 24 TV'den Gülistan Yazbaşı. You're here to raise your voice against Israel and make the world to take an action about what's happening in Gaza. What are your expectations after this announcement?
Expectations after this announcement, what are the expectations?
Of what?
After this announcement, what are the expectations?
Our expectations are to emphasize this critical historical moment of emergency and to suggest that one powerful potential initiative is the empowerment of the General Assembly of the UN to organize a protective armed intervention in Gaza to overcome the disruption of humanitarian aid and the continuing devastation and destruction of the people that have survived to this point. It is to raise consciousness, to encourage action, both in civil society and by institutional actors, governments and international coalitions, UN, whoever will act, including regionally, but also globally, and also individually.
Abdullah Tekin, Habertürk. Thank you for coming to Professor. I would like to ask you about, regarding the responsibility of PROTEC, is there a legal basis for the military invention when it comes to preventing irreversible to human rights violation? Thank you very much.
Could you?
Legal foundation of the R2P.
The R2P was a reaction to the Kosovo war, NATO war, and it arose out of the sense that in the post-colonial world, it was necessary to find an alternative language to humanitarian intervention, which posed a threat to the sovereignty of states. So this shifted the legal focus to the responsibility of international society in the future to act to protect an endangered civilian population. This was attempted in a, unfortunately, geopolitical, manipulative way in Libya back in 2011, when what was presented by the NATO countries at the Security Council and induced the abstention of skeptical members of the Security Council, but no veto, was a humanitarian undertaking to protect the supposedly endangered people of the city of Benghazi. But what was actually done by NATO was to engage in a regime-changing intervention that resulted in the lawless execution of Gaddafi, the long-term leader of Libya, and discredited the R2P in the Syrian civil war context, because there was no trust any longer on the part of China and Russia above all. But I think with the unified sense of this Gaza emergency and reality and the degree of mobilization of civil society, R2P is an instrument that can be refashioned for a constructive use as a humanitarian tool, and one which can, in addition to relieving the emergency, also function to promote Palestinian realization of their basic rights, including the right of self-determination.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Feyza from Turkey Today. Thank you so much for your statement. If you'd allow me, I have two questions. You have mentioned that we have reached a climax of this conflict or genocide. What makes you think that this exact point is the climax? Couldn't it get worse, or wasn't it worse before? And my second question would be, what do you think there's a list here of actions that can be done to help people in Gaza. Which one do you think should be prioritized or should be done first? Thank you.
This is the climax.
Yes.
What happened?
Of course, critics of what has been happening in Gaza have pointed prematurely to a climax over these 22 plus months. So I do so with a certain hesitation, because it is possible, as your question suggests, that worse is still to come in terms of the forced dispossession of the surviving Gazan population, which has certainly been speculated, and the total Israeli occupation, the failure to treat Palestinians as entitled to protection in their own homeland, that there is that nightmare scenario that could lead us to say this wasn't the ultimate crisis, but just a severe stage in the genocidal process. But I think it's sufficiently severe that it's correct to view it as an emergency, given the widespread malnutrition, traumatization of the entire population, and the fact that we don't have, fortunately, there's not much experience of how far a people under this sort of intense 24/7 kind of pressure, military, constant drone and other forms of military attack. How long can a population withstand that kind of experience? So we, of the Gaza Tribunal, feel that this is an emergency, and maybe it isn't the ultimate climax. That remains to be seen. but it's certainly a climax in terms of humanitarian urgency.
So, very small place in Gaza. It's only 40 kilometers
Yes.
square. 1 million people squeezed.
Yeah, it's ironic. I've been to Gaza several times, and it's ironic that Gaza was one of the most crowded places in the world before all of this crisis unfolded. So you can only imagine what it means to constantly move the population around, destroy 85% of their residential facilities. People have no homes. The weather is either too hot or too cold, and they don't have access to healthy water, diseases of various sorts, from malnutrition, from this undrinkable water, from open sewage, and it's a total nightmare experience that was always viewed as something that was forcing the population to live at a subsistence level. So now one's driven by the harshest means the people of Gaza to something far below a subsistence level. And we really don't know, we don't have the experience of what that will eventuate in, what will be the real outcome in terms of human development.
Actions priority, second question.
Well,
Second question, actions priority.
Oh, yes. I think that the most tangible and significant action priority would be an extension of the arms embargo, because that's what enables Israel to embark on not only the violence in Gaza, but in the regional violence. And there's speculation at the present time that a second Iran war will again be provoked by Israel as a way of distracting attention from what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, which is part of the picture of this present emergency, but it hasn't been the focus of the Gaza Tribunal for obvious reasons, that the genocide has been focused on Gaza, and the spillover from it is being experienced by settler violence in the West Bank and efforts to dispossess as many Palestinians as possible and have them leave. The ultimate objective of the Zionist project is to stabilize Jewish supremacy and to minimize the physical presence and political resistance of the Palestinian people whose homeland this is.
Hello, good morning. It's Sudasim from Apaçık Radio. I have a question regarding your words, the seeking of activism to change governmental stance from the people and the individuals. What would that entail, and how could it be enforced? Thank you.
Well, I gave as the example what was done in response to South African apartheid racism. The situation is different, of course, in regard to Israel in a number of fundamental ways. And one has to configure the action initiatives in relation to what is seen to be effective. And that's a matter of both speculation and some knowledge of the specifics of the situation. And it's obvious from the way Israel has tried to silence journalists and truth-telling generally that the government is exceedingly sensitive to criticism. So raising this critical awareness and making it clear that Israel is a pariah state, is an outlaw state, seems to me to be a second kind of action priority. And that means not participating with Israelis in sporting events or cultural activities, not cooperating academically or in scientific and technological projects, exerting pressure on corporations not to deal with Israel. All of these things are concrete, tangible, and doable.
Flotilla, you have to mention flotilla also maybe.
And one thing that has captured the imagination, and Gaza Tribunal has given it a certain symbolic support, is the formation of freedom flotillas. The most publicized recent one was the Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist, and the boat that was detained by Israel and the passenger, the activists deported, was the Malvine, and there is now underway supposedly a 40 ship flotilla with Malaysian support, and that will certainly make an important impact.
Thank you. It's Nisa from Anadolu Agency. You are calling for armed UN protective force. Given repeated Security Council deadlocks over Gaza so far, how realistic is that the General Assembly will take such drastic action? As you know, some Western democracies have recognized Palestinian statehood recently, but simultaneously crack down on pro-Palestinian activism at home. So there is a strict contradiction. So what do you think about this situation?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question. It's as realistic as the political will that is present is motivated to really stop this genocide. And one of the ways that it could be made realistic is by exerting enough pressure on the Israeli and US governments so that they consent to a protective force being sent to Gaza. Now that seems unlikely at the moment to be realized, but the situation in Gaza is sufficiently desperate that only unlikely initiatives have any chance of really rescuing the population from near certain tragedy. And therefore, I think it is an appropriate kind of undertaking to support as a matter of conscience and to mobilize as much pressure as possible to make it realistic. Realism reflects the political atmosphere, and that can be changed by people. See, the real underlying faith of this kind of tribunal is in people, not in governments. And it hopes that the mobilization of people will have a desirable political impact, historical impact, as has happened often. I experienced the impact of the anti-war movement during the Vietnam period, which surprised many people in the US by changing what seemed like a very deep Cold War type commitment of the US government to carry on with the war. So things happen that are not predictable and seem unlikely, but are worth struggling to make happen. And I suppose that's the faith that guides the Gaza Tribunal.
Thank you.
Başka var mı? Soru yok. Buyurun.
Hi, Hazel Ward from AFP. You've spent many decades making many calls for...
Which organization are you?
From AFP, Hazel Ward, Agence France Presse. Professor Falk, you've spent many decades calling for action and change in Israel's attitude and actions towards the Palestinians. But you, of all people, have seen the inaction of both the UN and global governments. At this stage, what faith or what hope do you have that that can change? And secondly, I'm interested to know, you spoke about affecting change in the US and in Israel itself. There were mass protests across Israel with hundreds of thousands of people speaking out. What hope do you have that change could come from within Israel that could actually have an impact on the government's stance? Thank you.
First question, what has been changed now? You have been advocating the UN, but what is right now most recently? This is the first.
Well, the UN is a organization of states dominated, according to its charter, by the states that won World War II, the permanent members, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which makes no sense if you really intended a framework that would privilege law, because you wouldn't make the 5 most powerful and dangerous countries having an exemption from law if you were trying to create an effective legal order. So in this sense, the UN was designed to fail in a situation where the strategic interests of these P5 actors collided with the requirements of complying with international law. So there should be no surprise. At the same time, it would be a mistake to dismiss either international law or the UN. The UN has done more than any other institutional actor in awakening people to the reality of what has been happening in Gaza. And the drama surrounding the current special rapporteur is evidence of her influence as well as of the UN's impotence when it comes to stopping the genocide. So you have the 2 realities in opposition to one another. And so we should respect the UN for making more people aware, in association, as I've been trying to say, with courageous journalists who've been reporting from Gaza and from the region in a manner that tries to break through the fog of war and the state propaganda that has been disseminated by the most influential media platforms in the West. And the same thing with international law. It's been admirably and professionally interpreted by the International Court of Justice and by the International Criminal Court, but there's an enforcement gap, and that was intended. It was intended to depend for enforcement on Security Council implementation, which means it was subject to the veto. And so the drafters of the UN Charter were persuaded to give these geopolitical actors, who are now really Russia, China, and the US, they were persuaded to give them primacy when it came to global security and war prevention. That's not really a failure of the UN, it's a characteristic of the UN as it was created and evolved. With international law, you have these authoritative decisions. The courts in the UN system and internationally can declare the law authoritatively, but as matters now stand, only civil society can enforce it when it is strategically resisted. But what international law does is to lend legitimacy to these action initiatives, including the global, the Gaza Tribunal. Because law has been declared but unenforceable, such initiatives become legitimate, whereas they wouldn't be if you had no legal foundation. So although law isn't properly enforced, it legitimates informal or civil society methods of enforcement. And again, it places faith in the capabilities of people to do what governments refuse to do.
So that's the second question. U.S. and Israel, civil society, you think they can change something?
Okay. Oh, yeah. There is, in the U.S. particularly, a quite dramatic change in public opinion, including on the part of the Jewish minority, that is seeking, exerting pressure to change the policy to one that is at least balanced and non-interventionary. The difficulty is that special interests, including the profitability of corporations that have been supplying the weaponry and other kinds of technology to Israel, have a great deal of influence on the US Congress. So you have two opposing forces in the US. You have the Congress and the White House welcoming Netanyahu as a hero of our times, honorifically, and you have civil society branding him as the most serious war criminal since Hitler. And both of those forces are in tension. How that tension will be resolved is bound up with all sorts of other issues and very complex. In Israel, you have a much less of a tension between civil society and the government. There's a lot of criticism of Netanyahu, but it again relates not so much to the treatment of the Palestinians, but of his failure to accord priority to the rescue of the Israeli hostages that were captured on October 7th. And that has created a polarization in Israel between the ultra-right religious part of the Netanyahu coalition and its secular part. And Netanyahu has consistently given in to the right and probably has sympathies with the right as well as private interests in keeping his coalition in power. So he has a combination of personal and political interests. And although some prominent Israelis have spoken out in Israel, I don't have much current confidence that that will lead to any kind of meaningful change of policy.